Hello and welcome to episode 15 of the Barndoor restoration. Last episode I built some replacement parts, and if you missed that and want to get caught up, I left a link in the description to the playlist to make it easy to get caught up. This episode mainly did the transmission hoop. So the way these are set up, the transmission sits here. The nose of the transmission sits in a rubber block, and then there's a bracket that has two rubber mounts, bolts here, to hold the other end of the transmission. And the motor bolts to the transmission with 4 bolts. So all the transmission motor hanging out here is all supported by this pipe. This one, first it had some dents in the bottom of it, quite a few dents in the bottom, and it had some thin spots. Now I didn't really know what I was getting into in there. There's no real way to straighten it, a pipe like that, because it is quite thick steel. It's a 1.7 millimeter wall, and because it was that thick, there's no real way to, if you pulled it, it would just pull the center of the dents out. It wouldn't have done a good job. So I knew I was going to have to cut out the dents, but I didn't know what the rest of it was like. So I went over it with a pick hammer, and I did find, you can tell by the noise if it's thin or thick. And I found a couple spots that were thin, and I was actually able to knock a hole through a couple spots. So I decided that it was easier just to replace the whole bottom. So I did cut out one section with the larger dent to see what was in there before I decided to cut everything off. And I realized the bottom was rusted a bit, but the sides and the top was all nice and thick. So there wasn't any rust there. So that was helpful. Now that pipe is about 44 millimeter, but it's not round. I suspect it was built in a press, so it was squished a little bit. So it changes sizes as you go along it a bit. Now I didn't have any metal the correct thickness because it's 1.7. The 14 gauge is 1.9 millimeter. A 16 gauge I think is 1.2 or 3. And it's going to be a bit of pain to make that curve. So I started looking for pipe. I actually found a piece of exhaust pipe in my pile that was exactly 1.7 millimeters thick, so that was perfect. So I split the top off it and then started forming it to get that curve. So that was a long process. It probably took me 3 hours to get that bottom piece curved correctly. Because the radius is not even, it's a little peaked in the middle, and then it flattens out and then it curves a bit more at the ends. And then the pipe is a little flatter at the two ends than it is in the middle, a little more round in the middle. So it's basically a slow process of tapping on this pipe, putting a curve into it, and then the sides were rolling in by themselves because the way tapping the pipe curves it makes the sides pull in. So they'll get the right shape and trim it to fit. I also had on this side a chain that's been wrapped around this and pulled back. When they did, they left some offset dents from the chain links. So I decided I needed to fix that, so I cut that section out and smoothed that patch. There was no rust there, so I just welded that one back in. I also took the caps out the end of this pipe. So there's a cap on each end to keep the dirt out, and they just push in and have a couple welds. This side had a couple little welds on it, dug right out, the cap popped right out. This side had well, almost one side completely welded in, so it took about more work to grind that one out of there. These were very rusty, so they need to be replaced anyway. Once they were out, the media blaster, and I actually blasted the inside of this pipe. And with the bottom cut out hole here in the ends, I was able to get that pretty clean in there. And I also sprayed lots of zinc paint in, really heavily. So after that, I welded it together. Welded pretty easy. Once it's welded, I used a 40 grit, a flappy disc thing in the grinder, and then I use an orbital sander with a 60 grit to go over it and make the metal nice and smooth. It does a nice job. These plugs. This is what you call, well, here we call them freeze plugs or frost plugs. It's just basically a cup style expansion plug. You find them in the engine blocks a lot of times, in the coolant passages, plug them off. So this one's a little bigger. So this is a 42.3 millimeter plug, but it's quite a bit thicker than the original. The original plug was 0.7 millimeter thick, so this is like almost 2. So I'm going to sand it down, probably with the grinders, grind it down, so it'll fit in there snug. I also need to thin it a bit. It's a little thin. The original was 9 millimeters thick, and this one's 11. Actually, it looks to be a bit more than 11, but so anyway, I'm going to use these to make new plugs to go in there. And I think I'm going to try and seal them in. I think the plan is to put a little maybe JB weld around in there, tap them in, and after that dries, just put a couple gobs of weld to make it look like an original. When I welded the bottom and the patch in, I made certain to make it airtight so there's no pinholes in the weld. These caps are airtight also to prevent this from ever rusting in there. So the couple other things I did. One, I had a hole on one side and split seam on the other. Basically, it was a part of the top of the frame, and there was no spot welds in the spot because the frame rail was put on after. They couldn't put a spot welder in here, so there was a bit of a gap, and that allowed the frames to spread apart and get some dirt and rust in there. Now this one also had quite a bit of rust, deep pitting and a hole in that section. The other side had very deep pitting also in that spot. So I cut those out. Luckily the inside was perfect. There was no rust inside. I cut those out, media blast them, zinc painted in there and welded the new ones back in. And I just plug welded them so they'd be a little stronger than the original. I also straightened this frame rail. It had a weird twist to it. This bottom piece here kind of bowed out a bit. The back was in the right spot, but it kind of went bowed out in the back in. I believe it was built like that, and there's also a dent on the inside, or sorry, on the outside of this frame rail that I tried to straighten out when I was repairing this section, and then realized that that dent was there when it was welded to the torsion beam. So the frame rail was bent when it was assembled. And I think this bulge here was actually in it when it was assembled. But I decided to take it out. I just put a big pipe wrench on it, twisted this in, and that left the arm in a bit. And then I just lifted it up out of the jig a bit, put a tube on it, and pulled it back over. So I was able to straighten that frame rail out by hand. And it's not bolted in the jig right now, but it's lined up perfectly. So quite happy with it. So this back frame is basically ready to start welding things on. I have a couple little notches to cut in where the top hat goes across on each side, and a few holes to drill. And besides that, this back frame is finished. So I think that's about it for this episode. Last episode I mentioned I was having a bit of an issue with the brake on the top hats, not getting a good bend, and I made a tweak to the brake and bent another top hat, and this one came out quite nice. I'm very happy with this one. The problem was the radius on this wasn't being sharp enough before, and it's because the brake was flexing a little bit. It takes a lot of strain to bend something so long and straight. So this one came out really straight, really nice. So I'm happy with that. Still a few more tweaks to do to the brake, some improvements, but quite happy with it. Next episode, I'm going to move to the front. I want to start getting the storage compartment under the front seat built. So I need to repair the sides, the bottom and the front section. I'll start working on that. And I have a few more bits and pieces to build for back here. So I'm going to wait to get all the floor structure built before I start welding this together. So keep watching for some video of my work and the detailed areas. And also thanks for the comments. I always appreciate those. And well, thanks for watching.